That morning began like so many others in my life. The sun came in timidly through the kitchen window, illuminating the old table where I had coffee for decades. I was alone, as I almost always was, listening to the familiar sound of the clock on the wall. I never imagined that in a few minutes, everything I believed to be safe would collapse mercilessly. When the phone rang, I thought it was a mistake. I hardly receive any calls. I answered slowly, with the still hot cup in my hands. On the other side, a formal voice introduced herself as an employee of a notary's office. The tone was neutral, too professional to bring anything good. My stomach tightened before I even understood the reason for the call. She said my full name, confirmed my data, and then uttered the phrase that changed my life. "Are you aware of the sale of the property registered in your name?" I was silent. My heart started beating fast, as if it was trying to escape from my chest. I asked her what she was talking about, her voice already cracking. The woman explained that the house where I live had been sold weeks before and that there was a contract signed by me. A contract. Signed by me. My hands started shaking so much that I had to prop my phone up on the table. I said I never sold my house. I never signed anything. I never thought about leaving here. She replied coldly that everything was legally registered and that I should seek my family for clarification. The call ended like this, dry, with no room for doubts or explanations. I stared at the phone, as if he could still tell me that it was all a terrible mistake. I got up slowly and walked around the house. I touched the walls, the furniture, the old photographs. Each corner kept a part of my life. There I raised my children, there I cried the death of my husband, there I grew old. How could anyone sell all this without me knowing? Fear began to take over me. It wasn't just the house. That's what that accusation said about me. Were they saying I was going crazy? That I didn't know what I was doing anymore? The mere idea of being seen like this hurt me more than any threat of eviction. Shortly after, my son appeared. It brought no concern, no surprise. I brought papers. He threw them on the table and said, in a harsh voice, that I had sold the house and needed to take the consequences. That cut me inside. It wasn't just an accusation, it was a sentence. I tried to explain, but he didn't want to listen. He said I was confused, that maybe I had forgotten. Every word of his diminished me, pushed me to a place where I had never been. For the first time, I felt that I was no longer seen as a mother, but as a problem to be solved. At that moment, I understood that something very wrong was happening. The call from the notary's office was not just bad news. It was the beginning of a silent war, fought within my own family. And I still had no idea how much this betrayal would cost me. The fact that you've chosen to hear this story so far says a lot about who you are. What comes next is not just about a betrayed woman, but about dignity, truth, and courage, things that all of us, at some point, need to stand up for. If you believe that stories like this deserve to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel and help me keep these truths alive. He stood in my kitchen as if he were in neutral territory, not inside the house where he grew up. I remained seated, with my hands resting on the table, feeling my heart beat heavily. The silence between us was thick, uncomfortable, and brought a bad omen. Nothing in that look seemed to worry. It was a charge. Without asking permission, he pulled up a chair and spread the papers in front of me. He said that everything was there, that there was no mistake. The contract, the sale, the signing. He spoke fast, as if he had already repeated that story many times to himself. When I looked at those leaves, I felt a chill rise down my spine. I pointed to the signature and said that that was not my handwriting. I've known my name since I was a little girl. I've signed documents my whole life. But he laughed, a short, impatient laugh, and replied that I was mistaken. It's yours, Mom. It's here. There is no point in denying it. That hurt more than a scream. I tried to explain that I would never sell the house without talking to anyone. He said that this place was all I had. He sighed deeply, as if he were dealing with a stubborn child, and said that I needed to accept reality. That maybe I had signed without remembering. That these things happen with age. Every word of his diminished me a little more. It wasn't just the accusation of having sold the house. It was the silent suspicion that I was no longer able to decide for myself, that my memory failed, that I was no longer reliable even to myself. I asked where the money from the sale was. He didn't talk. He said that later they would see this, that now the important thing was to resolve the situation without scandal. That answer ignited something inside me. If I had sold, I would have known exactly where every penny was. The emptiness of that explanation terrified me. He suggested that I rest, that I was very nervous. He spoke of doctors, evaluations, care. But it didn't sound like care. It sounded like control. For the first time, I thought that maybe they wanted something more than the house. Maybe they wanted to shut me up. When he left, the house became even quieter. I sat on the couch and cried like I hadn't cried in years. Not only of sadness, but of humiliation. I was being judged, discredited, pushed out of my own history. I took the contract again and observed every detail. The signature looked like mine, but something about it didn't add up. The line was too hard, too hasty. I always wrote my name calmly. That wasn't just a mistake. It was a well-rehearsed lie. That late afternoon, as the sun set behind the windows, I felt real fear. Not just losing the house, but losing who I was. Something inside me said that this accusation was just the beginning, and that if I didn't react, I would lose much more than walls and roof. The next day, I woke up with a strange feeling, as if the house was no longer completely mine. I walked through the rooms in silence, observing everything more closely than ever. Each object seemed laden with a new weight, as if it were about to be torn from me at any moment. I was still trying to understand how, all of a sudden, my home had become a reason for accusation. The first messages started arriving early. Relatives who rarely spoke to me now wanted to know the situation. The words came disguised as concern, but they carried judgment. They asked why I had sold the house, why I didn't warn anyone, as if the fault was obvious and the explanation was my obligation. When I went out to pick up the mail, I felt the eyes of the neighbors. Some averted their faces, others whispered. That hurt me deeply. I was always respected on that street. Now, it seemed that I was the confused old woman who sold her own house and didn't remember. Shame began to mix with fear. My son came back in the afternoon, this time more impatient. He said that the situation was getting ugly and that I needed to collaborate. He said that if he continued to deny it, it would only make things worse for me. That sounded like a threat, even though he tried to disguise it with a calm tone. He commented that some people thought I was no longer well in my head. That maybe someone would better take care of my finances. That sentence hit me like a punch. It was no longer just about the house. It was about my capacity, my autonomy, my dignity. I tried to argue, but he wouldn't let me finish a sentence. Everything I said was interpreted as confusion or stubbornness. The more I talked, the more it seemed to confirm the image they were creating of me. It was then that I realized how lonely I was. After he left, I sat at the table with the papers scattered around. The contract, which had previously been just weird, now felt like a gun pointed at me. Each line was used to prove me wrong, even though I knew deep down that the truth didn't belong to me. I cried again, but this time the crying was different. It wasn't just pain. It was revolt. I knew who I was. He knew what he was capable of. And knowing that they were using my age against me sparked something I thought I had lost over time. I took a deep breath and began to reread everything calmly. For the first time, instead of feeling accused, I tried to feel like an investigator of my own life. If that signature wasn't mine, someone put it there. And that meant there was a culprit, not a confused old woman. That night, lying in my bed, I took a long time to sleep. The house creaked with the usual sounds, but nothing seemed normal. I was still seen as guilty by everyone, but inside me something was beginning to change. Maybe that house was being used against me. But I decided that I would not leave quietly. The next morning, I woke up with a chest pain that wasn't physical. It was the feeling that something invisible was closing in around me. I made coffee, but I could barely drink it. The house looked the same, but I no longer felt safe inside it. It was as if every wall was watching me, waiting for the moment to kick me out. I spent the day avoiding the phone. I was afraid of new calls, more accusations, of hearing again that I was to blame. Even so, he played. It was my son. He said he needed to talk to me urgently, that the situation was getting out of control. The way he spoke chilled me inside. When he arrived, he did not come alone. It brought an air of authority that I had never seen in him. He sat down in front of me and said he was worried about me, that all this was too big for me to handle alone. He spoke slowly, as if he were explaining something to someone who doesn't understand things well. Then came the sentence that took me off my feet. He suggested that perhaps it was time to assess my ability. He said that some relatives felt that I was no longer in a position to take care of my own affairs. That this would be for my good. At that moment, I realized that the house was just the beginning. I felt a deep fear, one of those that tighten their throats. It wasn't just about losing the roof. It was losing the right to decide about my own life. Of being treated as someone incapable, dependent, disposable. I, who had always solved everything by myself, was now being placed on the margins of my own existence. I tried to defend myself. I said I was lucid, that I knew very well what was happening. But he just shook his head, as if confirming exactly what he wants to prove. The more I talked, the more it seemed to feed their narrative. After he left, I sat for a long time, staring into nothingness. I thought about how many women my age must go through this in silence. How many accept it out of fear, out of fatigue, because they don't have the strength to fight. For the first time, I felt the real weight of the word interdiction. I got up and went to the bedroom. I opened an old drawer where I kept documents, letters, souvenirs. There was my entire story, organized by me, over decades. That was not the work of someone confused. That was proof that I always knew how to take care of myself. I held those papers as if they were a shield. I understood that if I didn't react now, I wouldn't have another chance. They didn't just want the house. They wanted control, silence, my surrender. That night, I made a promise to myself. They could try to take everything away from me, but they wouldn't take my voice without a fight. I still didn't know how to prove the truth, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to disappear without a trace. In the days that followed, I realized that the silence of the family said more than any direct accusation. No one called me anymore to find out how I was doing. The messages were short, cold, always revolving around the house and the problems I was causing. It was as if I had stopped being a person and became an obstacle. My oldest grandson was the only one who showed up unannounced. He entered the house carefully, avoiding looking too much into my eyes. He sat on the couch, fidgeting with his hands, nervous. He asked if I was okay, but he didn't seem prepared to hear the answer. There was guilt in that silence of his, and that caught my attention. I told him that I never sold the house. I said firmly, looking straight at his face. He swallowed, looked away and said he didn't know anything. But his body said otherwise. Those who don't know anything don't tremble like that. There, for the first time, I felt that someone was hiding something from me. I asked him if he had seen his father sign anything, if he knew about meetings, conversations, plans. He answered little, always with incomplete sentences. He only said that things had been thought about for a long time. That phrase echoed inside me like an afterthought. After he left, I kept thinking about everything I had missed over the years. Small decisions made without me, conversations interrupted when I entered the room, papers that appeared ready for me to just sign. I have always trusted. Perhaps too much. The daughter-in-law, on the other hand, became too kind. He called offering help, asking if I needed anything, but never touched on the main subject. That kindness tasted bitter. It seemed more like an attempt to keep me calm, distracted, collected. I started to connect the dots. My son's coldness, his grandson's discomfort, his daughter-in-law's false concern. None of it was improvised. There was a plan, and I was at the center of it without ever having been invited to participate. In the evening, I sat alone in the living room and mentally replayed the last few years. I remembered documents that I signed without reading properly, trusting. I remembered conversations in which I was told that I didn't have to worry. Perhaps the coup had not started now. Perhaps it was being built a long time ago. I felt anger, but also sadness. Not only for the house, but for the slow, silent betrayal, disguised as care. They didn't attack me all at once. They surrounded me, diminished me, preparing me to doubt myself. At that moment, I decided that I needed to stop just reacting. If there were silences that denounced them, I needed to learn to listen to them. The truth was there, hidden between pauses, looks and unspoken words. And I was ready to go after her. It was on a seemingly ordinary afternoon that I realized that not everything around me was as quiet as I thought. I was sweeping the sidewalk slowly, as I always did, when I felt a watchful look coming from across the street. Mrs. Margaret, my neighbor of many years, was standing by the gate, pretending to tend to the plants, but watching my every move with unusual care. She has always been discreet, the type who speaks little and listens a lot. We never had deep intimacy, just quick conversations about the weather or the neighborhood. Still, that day, she called me by name with a strange, almost urgent firmness. He asked if I was okay. Before I could answer, he said that they were saying weird things about me. My heart tightened. I asked what kind of comment. She took a deep breath and said that she heard on the street that I had sold the house and that I would soon leave. That hit me like a dry blow. The lie had already escaped the family and started to shape the way the world saw me. For the first time, I felt fear not only inside the house, but outside it as well. I decided to tell everything. I talked about the call from the notary's office, the contract, the signature that they said was mine, my son's coldness. I told them how they were treating me as someone confused, incapable, someone who needed to be controlled. As I spoke, Mrs. Margaret did not interrupt me once. His eyes followed every word, too attentive to simple curiosity. When I finished, she asked a simple but devastating question: "What about the money?" I was silent. She continued, calmly, asking where the value of the sale was, who had shown it, who had explained it. At that moment, I realized how much it all didn't make sense. If I had sold the house, the money would have been with me. But it never was. She then told me that she worked for many years in offices and had seen similar cases. Stories in which age was used as a weapon, in which documents appeared ready, in which decisions were made for the good of those who never asked for help. He said that blows like this almost always started with small manipulations, not big confrontations. For the first time since it all began, someone spoke to me without pity. Without treating me as fragile. She didn't call me confused or stubborn. She spoke to me as if I were a grown woman being deceived, not an incapable old woman. That moved me more than any previous accusation. Mrs. Margaret suggested that I seek help outside the family. He said that conflicts like this are not resolved when everyone is emotionally involved. She appointed a lawyer known to her, someone serious, discreet, who would know how to look at the documents without prejudice. The idea of involving a stranger scared me, but it also gave me hope. After she returned home, I stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, taking it all in. I felt ashamed for needing support from someone who was not my family. But at the same time, I felt something I hadn't felt in days: relief. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. There were real flaws in that story. That night, I hardly slept. I thought about how many times I trusted without question. How many times have I left decisions in the hands of others to avoid conflicts? Perhaps that confidence had been my greatest weakness. But I also realized that there was still time to react. As I closed the door of the house before going to bed, I touched the handle more firmly. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by something new. A spark of lucidity and courage. For the first time, I didn't feel like just a victim. I felt that I was about to become a problem for those who tried to deceive me. The next day, I woke up with the decision already made. For the first time since it all began, I didn't get out of bed feeling only fear. There was something different inside me, a restlessness that mixed anxiety and determination. I prepared the coffee calmly and put the contract on the table, as if preparing to face an enemy head-on. I sat down in front of those papers and began to look at them like never before. Not as someone accused, but as someone who seeks the truth. I ran my fingers over the pages, read every line, every clause, every difficult word that I would have ignored before. If that signature claimed to be mine, I needed to understand it better than anyone else. When my eyes rested again on the name at the bottom of the page, something became even clearer. The signature was hard, unhesitating, almost aggressive. I have always signed my name carefully, respecting each letter, as if it were present in the world. It seemed too rushed, too strange. I took old documents. Deeds, old contracts, receipts, even cards kept as souvenirs. I put everything side by side on the table. I compared, line by line, line by line. The more I compared, the more evident the difference became. That signature did not carry my time, my hand, my history. I felt a mixture of relief and indignation. Relief to confirm that my memory wasn't failing. Indignation at realizing how far they had come. It was not a misunderstanding. It wasn't confusion. Someone had forged my name with the clear intention of getting me out of the way. For the first time, I thought about how much my age was used against me. They counted on my silence, on my insecurity, on the possibility of me doubting who I am myself. They counted on fatigue, on the fear of conflict. But they didn't count on the fact that I still knew how to recognize my own writing. I remembered the words of Mrs. Margaret. From the simple question about money, everything was starting to fall into place. There was no sale, there was no consent, there was no forgetting. There was a plan. And I was the last obstacle between them and what they wanted. At that moment, I felt angry. Not an uncontrolled anger, but a lucid, cold anger that clears thoughts. The same anger that makes us stop asking for explanations and start demanding answers. I no longer needed to convince anyone with words. He needed proof. I kept the documents in a folder and wrote a note to myself, as if it were a commitment: this signature is not mine. Reading it aloud strengthened me. It was simple, direct, true. Something that no one could erase. I took a deep breath and picked up the phone. I called the number that Donna Margaret had given me. My hands were shaking a little, but my voice came out firm when I introduced myself. For the first time since the call from the registry office, I was not reacting. I was acting. When I hung up, I realized that something inside me had shifted. I was still a threatened woman, yes. But now it was also someone on the move. The signature might not be mine, but the fight, that one, I was ready to sign with all the letters. The building where the office was located seemed to carry the weight of many old stories. The high walls, the narrow hallway, the smell of old paper mixed with coffee made me feel small for a moment. I pressed the briefcase to my chest as if it were a protection. Inside there were not only documents, there was my entire dignity. While waiting to be called, I watched people coming in and out. Young, hurried, safe. I thought about how much I was out of tune with that environment. A lady accused of selling her own house. For a moment, I feared hearing again that it was all just a mess in my head. Fear almost made me get up and leave. When they called my name, I stood up carefully. The lawyer presented himself with simplicity, without titles, without arrogance. His gaze was neither hasty nor condescending. He asked me to sit down and just said, "You can start whenever you want." That was already more than I had been receiving for days. I told him everything. From the notary's call to the accusations inside my own kitchen. I talked about my son, the way he started talking to me as if I were incapable. At times my voice cracked, but I kept going. He was not there to please anyone. It was there to be heard. He didn't interrupt me once. He didn't try to summarize, he didn't try to explain it for me. He just listened. That gave me a strange, almost uncomfortable feeling, because I no longer remembered what it was like to speak without being discredited. When I finished, the silence between us was not embarrassing. It was respectful. I put the contract on the table and said, firmly, that signature was not mine. Not as a cry for help, but as a statement. He picked up the papers carefully, analyzed each page slowly, as if to know that there is something serious hidden between the lines. Then he did something unexpected. He took a blank sheet, signed his own name and asked me to do the same. My hands were shaking slightly, but I signed. He put my signature next to the one on the contract and watched in silence. Time seemed suspended. It was then that he frowned. He said that there were clear differences in the stroke, in the pressure, in the rhythm of the writing. He spoke of details that I would never have noticed on my own, but that confirmed what I felt from the beginning. That wasn't my handwriting. It wasn't my gesture. It was not my decision. He explained, calmly, what could be done. He spoke of graphotechnical expertise, the process, the risks. I said it wouldn't be easy, that my family would probably try to convince me to give up. He asked if I was sure that I wanted to move forward, because after that step, nothing would be silent anymore. I took a deep breath before answering. I said that the silence was already destroying me, that I couldn't lose my home, my honor and my voice at the same time. He nodded, as if acknowledging courage, not stubbornness. For the first time, I felt that someone saw me as a lucid woman, capable of fighting. When I left the office, the world looked different. The problems were still all there, but so was I. Not as a passive victim, but as someone who had taken the first real step to turn the tide. I was still afraid, yes. But now he walked alongside hope, and that changed everything. It didn't even take 24 hours for them to realize that I was no longer just crying in silence. The phone started ringing early, insistent, almost aggressive. They were not care calls, they were containment calls. Each touch seemed to say that I had gone too far, that I was leaving the place where I was expected to stay. My son showed up that same morning, unannounced. He entered the house with steps too firm for someone worried. He sat in front of me and started talking even before I offered coffee. He said that I was being misguided, that lawyers like confusion, that lawsuits only bring wear. He spoke as if he was protecting me, but his eyes said something else. He repeated several times that I needed to think about my health, that fight wasn't for someone my age. He used words like rest, tranquility, peace. None of them had anything to do with me. They were words chosen to make me retreat, to convince me that fighting for the truth was irresponsible. When I mentioned the forensic examination, his face changed. The rehearsed calm gave way to a barely disguised discomfort. He said that it would expose the family, that the neighbors would comment, that I was creating an unnecessary scandal. I found it curious how, suddenly, he cared so much about my public image, when he was the first to paint me as a confused old woman. After he left, the calls began in sequence. A relative said she was worried about me. Another said that I was being manipulated. A distant cousin even said that I should accept that time changes people and that trusting the younger ones was a sign of wisdom. That was not advice. It was a coordinated attempt to push me into silence. One call, in particular, marked me deeply. The person said that I was forcing a situation and that, deep down, maybe I didn't really remember signing it. That made me tremble with anger. It was not my memory that was on trial. It was their honesty. But they insisted on transforming my lucidity into stubbornness. Alone, at night, I felt the weight of everything fall on me. I wondered if it was worth facing so much pressure. I thought about the emotional exhaustion, the public judgment, the possibility of breaking ties that I had built over a lifetime. There was a moment when fatigue almost won out. But then I remembered the contract, from the false signature, from my son's cold look when he accused me. I remembered how they tried to make me doubt myself. Giving up now would not be peace. It would be surrender. It would be accepting the lie as truth just to avoid conflict. I also remembered the lawyer, the respectful way he listened to me, and Donna Margaret, who saw what my own family pretended not to see. Outsiders believed in me before mine. It hurt, but it also opened my eyes. When my son spoke to me again, I was different. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. He only said that the process would continue. That I wanted the expertise. That I needed the truth, not hastily made agreements. He looked at me as if I were someone else. Maybe I really was. After I was alone again, I felt a deep tiredness, but also a new firmness. The pressures would not stop. The closer to the truth, the stronger they would become. But I also knew that I could no longer retreat. That fight was no longer just for the house. It was for the woman I was becoming. After so much pressure, I had to move away from the external noise to hear something older inside me. I started to revisit memories that I had previously avoided, like someone who opens boxes stored in the back of the closet. They were not happy memories, but signs that I had ignored for years, believing that trusting was always the best choice. I remembered the first times my son started to help me with papers. He said it was to make it easier, to save me from fatigue. I thanked him and signed where he pointed out, without reading everything carefully. I never imagined that trust could be used against me. I also remembered family gatherings from which I left without fully understanding what had been decided. They always told me that I didn't have to worry, that everything was solved. Today, those phrases sounded like rehearsals of a control that was growing little by little, without me noticing. I started to gather old documents, statements, contracts, receipts. The more I looked, the more I noticed strange gaps. Matters resolved without my clear consent, values that never passed through my hands, decisions made in my name. The sale of the house no longer seemed like an isolated act. It was part of something bigger. I felt a knot in my stomach when I realized that maybe the plan had been years in the making. Not out of hatred, but out of interest. The house was the most valuable asset. I was the weakest obstacle. This realization hurt more than any direct accusation. I remembered my husband, now deceased, and how he always warned me not to trust blindly. At the time, I thought it was exaggerated. Today, his words echoed like a belated warning. Perhaps, after his death, I was more vulnerable than I imagined. I spent hours organizing everything, separating what made sense from what seemed strange. That gave me clarity, but also sadness. It was not easy to accept that part of my life had been manipulated by those I created. It was like discovering that the betrayal had not started now, it had only revealed itself now. At the same time, that personal investigation gave me strength. Each document analyzed was a step out of the image of a confused victim that they tried to impose on me. I was regaining not only facts, but control over my own history. I realized that the approaching truth would not just prove that the signature was fake, it would dismantle an entire narrative built to keep me dependent. And that explained their desperation for me to give up. When I finished organizing everything, I sat quietly and took a deep breath. The past was emerging, piece by piece. And I knew that when it came to the surface completely, nothing would be the same again. Neither for me, nor for them. The days leading up to the result of the forensic examination were the longest of my life. The weight had a physical weight, as if each hour dragged on just to remind me of what was at stake. I woke up early, but without energy, as if sleeping had ceased to be rest and had become just another way to pass the time. The house, which had always been my refuge, began to feel like a disputed territory. Every noise made me alert. Every car that stopped on the street made me think that someone was coming to pressure me again. I felt watched, evaluated, as if my own existence was under judgment. The lawyer called me a few times to say that the process was moving. He spoke cautiously, explaining that the forensic examination required time and precision. I listened to everything in silence, trying not to show the fear that was growing inside me. It wasn't just the outcome that scared me, but the possibility that even with the truth, I would still have to fight to be heard. At night, lying in bed, my mind didn't stop. I thought about what would happen if the report was not conclusive. I thought about losing my house, being declared incapable, seeing my story rewritten by others. The feeling of helplessness was sometimes so great that it made me cry in silence, so as not to give them the pleasure of seeing me weak. At times, I even doubted myself. Their insistence had been so constant that, for seconds, I wondered if there wasn't any chance that I had really signed without remembering. Soon after, indignation came. I knew who I was. He knew what he was capable of. That doubt was not mine. It had been planted. I started to occupy my time with small tasks so as not to go crazy. I organized drawers, cleaned old photographs, reread letters. Each memory was an anchor, something that reminded me that I had always been lucid, present, responsible. That helped me not to get lost in fear. I avoided contact with my family during those days. I needed to preserve my sanity. Any call from them was an attempt to destabilize me. Silence, this time, was my choice, not an imposition. It was the first time I had set clear boundaries. When the phone rang, my heart raced. Each call could be the answer that would change everything. I answered with bated breath, trying to prepare for any scenario. The wait was cruel because it no longer depended on me. I had already done everything in my power. On the eve of the result, I hardly slept. I sat in the living room in the dark, looking at the house in silence. I touched the walls, the furniture, as if I was saying goodbye, not knowing if that goodbye would be definitive or just a passing fear. That morning, I made a simple request. Not for revenge, nor for punishment. I only asked that the truth be stronger than the lie. If I had to lose something, it wasn't my dignity. And it was with this thought that I faced the day that would decide my fate. This is the hardest part to tell. Talking about it means reliving the betrayal, accepting that exposing this pain has an emotional cost that I will carry with me. If you've come this far, it's because you've understood that some truths only survive when someone has the courage to say them out loud. So I ask you, sign up, not as a support for me, but as a way to ensure that voices like this are not silenced when they need to be heard most. The phone call came on an eerily quiet morning, as if the house was holding its breath with me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking at the cold coffee, when the phone vibrated. I recognized the lawyer's number immediately. My whole body reacted before the mind. My heart raced, my hands sweated, and for a few seconds I considered not answering. I was afraid of the answer that could change everything, for the worse or forever. When I answered, his voice came too quiet for a small piece of news. He asked me to sit down, to take a deep breath. That was enough for my legs to weaken. I sat slowly, resting my hand on the table, feeling the weight of the last few days fall on my shoulders. He said that the report had been concluded. Every word seemed loaded with years of my life. There was a brief but interminable silence before the sentence that changed everything. He said that the graphotechnical expertise confirmed that the signature was not mine. He spoke of the line, the pressure, the rhythm incompatible with my writing. At that moment, I felt no joy. I felt something much deeper. A relief so great that it almost hurt. As if my body could finally release a weight that I had been carrying in silence. I closed my eyes and let the air out slowly. It wasn't just the house that was being returned to me. It was my lucidity. My word. My identity. Everything they tried to erase with a fake paper was now being restored by another, real paper. The lie had a name, date, and signature. And so is the truth. The lawyer continued talking about the next steps, about notifications, meetings, legal responsibilities. I listened, but part of me was distant. My mind went back every moment they called me confused. With each look of pity. With each attempt to convince me that I didn't know what I was doing anymore. That report was not just legal evidence. It was a moral reparation. When I hung up, I sat in absolute silence. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just stood there, feeling the truth settle inside me. Victory, when it comes after so much humiliation, does not explode. She sits down. She straightens her spine. It returns the ground under your feet. Shortly after, the messages began to arrive. Short, cautious, different. The tone had changed completely. Where there had been accusations before, there was now excessive care. Where once there was certainty, there was now fear. The news had spread, and I felt it in the air, like a change of weather. The joy I could feel was accompanied by sadness. Because winning meant confirming something much worse. It meant accepting that the betrayal was real. That someone in my own family had decided to erase me to benefit themselves. That realization hurt more than any threat of eviction. Even so, something inside me has changed. I walked around the house with a different posture. I touched the walls, the furniture, the photographs, no longer with fear, but with belonging. That house was still mine, but now I had also recovered something that was almost taken away from me, respect for myself. I knew the confrontation was yet to come. That the truth written on paper would need to be said out loud, in front of everyone. But in that moment, I allowed myself to feel something rare in recent times, inner security. The certainty that I was not wrong. That I have never been. The lie had been dismantled. Not completely exposed yet, but mortally wounded. And from that moment on, no one could call me confused without facing the truth. The house was still in dispute. The family would still crumble. But I was finally whole again. The meeting was scheduled for a heavy afternoon, one of those in which the sky seems to follow the mood of the people. I left home with a firm but attentive heart. It was no longer fear that I felt. It was consciousness. I knew that, after that meeting, nothing would ever be the same again. Neither for me, nor for them. When I entered the lawyer's room, everyone was already there. My son avoided my eyes immediately. Other relatives whispered quietly, interrupting the murmur as soon as they saw me enter. I felt the weight of those looks, but I didn't lower my head. I had already done this too many times in the last few months. I sat quietly, watching. There was tension in the air, a barely concealed anxiety. Everyone knew it was no ordinary conversation. That was no longer a request for me to accept the situation. It was the moment when the truth would come out of the paper and gain a voice. The lawyer began speaking calmly, explaining the reason for the meeting. He detailed the process, the request for expertise, the legal steps taken. As he spoke, I observed the faces around me. I saw hands clenching, legs swinging, short breaths. Their discomfort was visible. Mine is not. When he announced that the report confirmed the forgery of the signature, the silence was absolute. A heavy, embarrassing silence, impossible to ignore. The lawyer read the main passages, with technical precision, making it clear that there was no room for doubt. Each word was a clear blow to the lie they built. My son tried to get up. I said that it had all been a misunderstanding, that the intention was never to harm me. He spoke of protection, of care. The lawyer interrupted him firmly, explaining that forgery is a crime, regardless of the alleged intent. At that moment, I saw something I had never seen in him, fear. Other relatives began to explain themselves at the same time. Some said they didn't know anything. Others threw the responsibility on each other. That spectacle of justifications gave me painful clarity. It wasn't just greed. It was cowardice. No one wanted to admit what they did. When they gave me the floor, I stood up slowly. My voice came out firm, firmer than I imagined possible. I said I never sold my house. That I never signed that contract. But, above all, he said that what hurt the most was not the attempt to take away my roof, but the attempt to take away my dignity, using my age as an excuse. I looked directly at my son and said that confidence is not a sign of weakness. That I trusted because I loved it. Because I believed that family was protection, not a threat. I said that he had no right to erase me, to turn me into someone incapable of justifying a coup. He did not answer. He lowered his head. The lawyer then explained the legal consequences, the annulment of the sale, the next judicial steps. He talked about laws and deadlines, but, for me, something even bigger had already been resolved there. The truth had been told in public. The narrative had been broken. I was no longer the discredited woman in that story. When the meeting ended, no one approached me. There were no apologies, no attempts at reconciliation. Only silence and averted looks. Curiously, it didn't hurt me like it used to. I had already understood that losing the illusion of family was the price of regaining myself. I left that room feeling the weight of the years, but also the strength they gave me. The truth had been exposed. The confrontation had taken place. And even if loneliness came later, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would never again accept to treat me as someone who can be deceived and erased. The official decision came a few days after the meeting, through a simple, cold, emotionless document. The sale of the house was annulled. The recognized forgery. Everything I already knew was now also confirmed on paper. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph. Just a heavy silence, like the end of a storm that leaves the ground soaked. When I first read the document, my hands didn't tremble. I found this curious. For weeks, I lived in fear of every paper, every signature. Now, that same kind of paper caused me nothing but tiredness. Justice had been done, but the wear and tear had taken its toll. My lawyer explained the next steps carefully, spoke of responsibilities, of consequences for those who participated in the fraud. I heard everything, but I no longer felt the same urgency. The most important thing had been achieved. The house was mine. My voice too. I walked back home that day slowly. I observed the street, the neighbors, the rusty gate that I always complained about, but never changed. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. I was no longer the same woman who left there weeks ago, scared, discredited, about to lose everything. Some relatives tried to contact him. Short, careful messages, as if treading on unstable ground. There were no clear apologies, only timid, almost bureaucratic attempts at rapprochement. I read them all, answered few. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. Some wounds are not closed with hasty words. My son didn't show up. He didn't care. He did not write. Perhaps he was still trying to understand how he lost control of the situation. Perhaps he was dealing with his own consequences. For the first time, this was no longer my responsibility. Inside the house, I sat in the living room and watched the space in silence. That house had been the scene of the greatest betrayal of my life, but also of my greatest resistance. It was no longer just a place of past memories. It was living proof that I had survived. I felt a different loneliness. Not the loneliness of those who are abandoned, but that of those who have chosen not to surround themselves with lies anymore. It was a clean, hard, but honest solitude. And, curiously, less painful than living surrounded by falsehood. I realized that there would be no applause. No one would congratulate me for my courage. There would be no easy reconciliation, no family gathered at the table. The victory had come without a party, without an audience. And maybe that's how it needed to be. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in a long time. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was at peace with myself. The house had stayed. The truth too. And that, even without applause, was more than enough. The official decision came a few days after the meeting, through a simple, cold, emotionless document. The sale of the house was annulled. The recognized forgery. Everything I already knew was now also confirmed on paper. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph. Just a heavy silence, like the end of a storm that leaves the ground soaked. When I first read the document, my hands didn't tremble. I found this curious. For weeks, I lived in fear of every paper, every signature. Now, that same kind of paper caused me nothing but tiredness. Justice had been done, but the wear and tear had taken its toll. My lawyer explained the next steps carefully, spoke of responsibilities, of consequences for those who participated in the fraud. I heard everything, but I no longer felt the same urgency. The most important thing had been achieved. The house was mine. My voice too. I walked back home that day slowly. I observed the street, the neighbors, the rusty gate that I always complained about, but never changed. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. I was no longer the same woman who left there weeks ago, scared, discredited, about to lose everything. Some relatives tried to contact him. Short, careful messages, as if treading on unstable ground. There were no clear apologies, only timid, almost bureaucratic attempts at rapprochement. I read them all, answered few. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. Some wounds are not closed with hasty words. My son didn't show up. He didn't care. He did not write. Perhaps he was still trying to understand how he lost control of the situation. Perhaps he was dealing with his own consequences. For the first time, this was no longer my responsibility. Inside the house, I sat in the living room and watched the space in silence. That house had been the scene of the greatest betrayal of my life, but also of my greatest resistance. It was no longer just a place of past memories. It was living proof that I had survived. I felt a different loneliness. Not the loneliness of those who are abandoned, but that of those who have chosen not to surround themselves with lies anymore. It was a clean, hard, but honest solitude. And, curiously, less painful than living surrounded by falsehood. I realized that there would be no applause. No one would congratulate me for my courage. There would be no easy reconciliation, no family gathered at the table. The victory had come without a party, without an audience. And maybe that's how it needed to be. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in a long time. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was at peace with myself. The house had stayed. The truth too. And that, even without applause, was more than enough. If anything from this story stuck with you, share this video. Not because it is an isolated case, but because it reveals patterns that still silence, control and delegitimize so many people every day. By sharing, you can get that message to exactly those who need to hear that you're not alone, and that it's still possible to react. I'll stay here reading every comment, really. Tell me, from which city or country are you watching this, and what about this story crossed you the most? Your words are not lost, they reach me and mean more than you realize.